As terrorism increases across Europe, armed officers in the UK are now at the forefront of combating the growing threat.
We will do all we can to support our police and intelligence agencies with the resources and the capabilities that they need.
The pressure on those who risk their own lives and may have to take others is growing greater than ever.
If they pose an immediate threat to you, they cease to be a human being. They are a target because your brain has said, no, they have to be shot, and you shoot them.
Tony Long has been an armed police officer for 25 years. As part of the specialist firearms unit for the Metropolitan Police, he was one of an elite group responsible for protecting the public at all costs.
Some people might find the taking of a human life absolutely abhorrent. But there are circumstances where that has to happen and somebody has to do it. And that somebody happens to be people like me.
Long has shot 5 people, killing 3 of them. It's made him Britain's deadliest firearms officer.
I fired at his head. I fired a single shot at his head, and as I did that, his eyes seemed to flip open and roll up into his head.
But the last of these shootings saw him in the dock, charged with murder. Suddenly, a man who had volunteered to put his life on the line was facing a possible life sentence.
So do police accept their marksmen are out of control? Trial accused of murder. Anthony Long.
The majority of the public have an unrealistic expectation of what a police firearms officer can and cannot do, and they don't understand why a police officer can't shoot the gun out of someone's hand or shoot them in the leg.
Now, for the first time, Tony Long breaks the code of silence to reveal the hard truth about life in Britain's most elite armed police unit.
Easy turning in the back seat.
This is police footage as they tail a gang of suspected armed criminals. One of them is a man called Azel Rodney.
George! He's back to the car with the bag.
Earlier that day, police surveillance filmed Rodney collecting what they think are guns.
And the intelligence was that a gang of drug dealers had access to fully automatic weapons, and specifically something that they had said had indicated that they were Mach-10 submachine guns. It fires in excess of 1,000 rounds a minute, which is about 18 rounds a second.
The suspects are tailed to North London, where police intelligence suggests they will use the Mach-10 to rob Colombian drug dealers.
Silver Commander says, right, I want them stopped. I need them arrested. That means we're now being given the clearance to do the intervention. So I remember listening on the radio, somebody come up and said, Hale Drive.
Junction Hale Drive, near side.
And there we are, Hale Drive's on our near side now. I'm getting views of the subject vehicle, and I'm really concerned that we're burnt. The guy in the back seat, Azel Rodney, is looking back. I'm getting glimpses of the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror looking back at us. And it looks to me like there's a heated discussion going on in the car.
Long is convinced that the surveillance team have been compromised.
We think these guys have got fully automatic weapons in the car. That's what the intelligence is telling us. And the danger is, if we haven't got the element of surprise, we're giving them time to prep their weapons. We're approaching a roundabout. We hear over the radio, we're going to do it now if we get the opportunity.
It's suitable. We're looking to do it at the roundabout if he stops.
Almost immediately he says, attack, attack, attack. And the bandit car has come to a rest pretty much outside the pub. So by this time I've got my helmet on my head, I've got the G36 up like that. And I'm right alongside him, my vehicle comes to rest, and I've seen him duck down and spring back up again, and at that point I'm convinced he's got a MAC-10 in his hand and he's about to open fire, and my colleagues are deploying from the vehicle. So at that point, I've got no option. It all happened, you know, in half the time it's taken me to describe that to you.
Okay, hold, sit. Right, yeah, sweet as.
Long fired 8 shots in 2.1 seconds. Azelle Rodney was hit 6 times in the head and body. He died instantly.
Just give me an indication, is it a suspect and what the injury is?
Three weapons were found in the car. Despite the police intelligence, none of them were fully automatic.
I was working on the premise that when I saw him duck down and spring back up again, that he had got hold of a MAC-10 submachine gun, because that's what I was told. And that intelligence proved to be wrong. You know, it was a handgun, it was a fairly big handgun. It was a defective handgun, it wouldn't have fired. But the reality is, as a firearms officer, if you're told X, then you have to believe that X is X.
In line with standard procedure, Long was taken off armed duty pending a full investigation.
I was doing what I was trained to do. So in terms of how did I feel, I felt that I'd done my job. It is absolutely inevitable that sooner or later, police officers go out on enough operations, they're left with no opportunity other than to open fire. And that's exactly what happened on the night that Azelle Rodney died.
In 2006, the Crown Prosecution Service concluded there was insufficient evidence to convict anyone in connection with Rodney's death. Yet 8 years later, Tony Long was eventually charged with his murder. He would now have to justify his actions in front of a jury at the Old Bailey.
I had quite an idyllic childhood, actually. I was brought up in Sussex on a holiday camp in the 1960s. Shooting was just something that, certainly back in the 60s, you know, kids did, really. I had air rifles and air pistols as pretty much as long as I could remember. And when I went to school, I ended up in the shooting team, and I joined a local shooting club, and I discovered that I had a particular aptitude for pistol shooting, and I started winning a few competitions.
Tony Long joined the Met at the age of 18.
I remember being asked, you know, why I wanted to join, and I said, oh, you know, I want some excitement. And they said, you do realise it's not going to be car chases every day. And I remember thinking, well, I hope it is, you know, like in the Sweeney. It was the 70s, so you'll have to excuse me. Bubble perm, flares, 2-inch revolver, chasing bad guys over rooftops, really. So that's what it was, for me, that's what police work was about. And I kind of assumed that everyone else joined the police for the same reasons.
But as Long discovered, especially when he volunteered for the Met's armed unit in 1983, the reality was somewhat different.
Police firearms tactics are all about avoiding confrontation. We were encouraged as authorised firearms officers to contain a situation, to hold back, to negotiate. You know, if a suspect was in a building, not to go in and confront him, but to call him out to us. 999 times out of 1,000, we do that without having to shoot.
It wasn't until 2 years later that Long fired his gun at a suspect for the first time.
Boxing Day of 1985. It's my son's birthday. I'm aware that there's a siege going on in Northolt in West London. And a man has murdered a woman, thrown her body out the window, and is now holding the woman's child hostage.
Convicted criminal Errol Walker had taken the 4-year-old girl hostage for over 24 hours.
Right, well, this is the top floor of Pointer Court. We're outside flat 64, which was our control.
News crews gathered to cover the unfolding drama. Tony Long had been called in alongside the hostage negotiators.
So this is where I spent most of the day. It was cold, it was wet, it was miserable. What would happen is the negotiators would go to the window, they'd talk to him, and then they'd go back, and then he'd be left with this empty balcony. Errol Walker became emboldened, and he started to come out. And what he would do is, if he had the little girl with him, he'd come out, and he'd sit the little girl here, his arm would be around her, and he'd basically be doing the sort of mad Messiah act and shouting down to the people. They'd be shouting back at him.
As the day wore on, the presence of armed officers agitated Walker.
Fucking marksmen around the back! You fucking blowing, you lot! You fucking done it now!
The wall over there was a riot shield propped up, and he'd obviously seen it on one of his little soirees out onto the balcony and decided that he wanted that to add to his protection inside the flat. He's reached his shield and he's now running back. And the next thing we know, all we can hear is all hell breaking loose on this balcony. The team leader is standing here right on the door, and he could see Walker on the other side, and Walker was shouting, "You've done it now, you've done it, she dies, she dies, she dies." And we were committed to carrying out an assault at that point. By this time, I'm coming down the balcony, I've got the grenade in my hand, I pull the pin out, and as I go past the window, I chucked it in, and literally the whole window exploded over the top of my head. And I clambered in the window, and once I come in, I find that Walker is thrown himself down on the settee. He's got the little girl across him, and he's holding her like a human shield, and he's got the knife up like that. And all I'm getting is a little bit of light coming through a chink in the curtains. And I brought my gun up, and it was just too dark to see my sights. So I made a decision to fire a pair of shots instinctively at the furthest point away from the little girl, which was his shoulder. And as I fired the 2 shots, he plunged this 6-inch carving knife down into the little girl's neck. And I fired at his head. I fired a single shot at his head. And as I did that, his eyes seemed to flip open and roll up into his head, and he slumped, and the little girl fell out of his arms. I remember holding the child, and as I'm running back towards the stairs, she's completely limp. It's like she's dead. Got down to the bottom of the stairs. I remember handing the child across to the ambulance crew, and I found myself in amongst this crowd of about 200 people with a revolver in my hand, getting them out of the way and helping the ambulance to get out. And then made my way back up to the stairs and into our control room. All sorts of emotions going through my head. Like I said, I didn't know whether Walker was dead. I didn't know whether the child was going to make it. So, yeah, difficult.
Remarkably, Errol Walker survived being shot in the head. And despite being stabbed, his young hostage also lived.
The fact that she was 4 and it was my son's 3rd birthday, I think probably hit me later. Certainly afterwards, you know, when I went home and I saw my own son sitting there and thought, well, his daddy hasn't been here for Boxing Day, but he's been playing with his toys and watching cartoons on the TV, and he's safe. I suspect it was probably around about that point that I sort of put the two situations together.
The siege at Northolt was the first time Long's unit had opened fire. An armed unit that had been formed after the largest single killing of police officers in British history.
Detective Sergeant Head, Police Constable Geoffrey Fox, and Temporary Detective Constable David Wummel had been shot down.
On the 12th of August 1966, 3 police officers were shot dead on routine patrol in West London. The press called it the Braybrook Street Massacre.
These 3 deaths are a tragic chapter in the history of Britain's police. The brutal manner in which they were killed has aroused a great wave of public sympathy for the men who protect us from such ruthless criminals.
Yeah, quite emotional, actually. Quite emotional.
When I joined, when I was at training school, this was still talked about, this incident was talked about with a great deal of reverence. You know, if this was to happen today, it would still be massive news. And of course, there was a huge respect for the police at that time, far more so than there is now. There were 3 suspects, but one man in particular, Harry Roberts, went to ground. And it was the huge manhunt for Harry Roberts that really highlighted just how ill-equipped the British police, or certainly the Metropolitan police, were for dealing with armed suspects. You know, something had to change, and this was the catalyst.
The 3rd man wanted in connection with the London police killings has been the subject of a nationwide hunt.
Roberts evaded the police for weeks, even with the whole nation on the hunt.
It ended after police and dogs had flushed him out.
Long's former colleague, Tony Gray, was one of the officers charged with finding him.
Harry Roberts was on the run and he was being seen all over the country. Yeah. And I was at Kingston Police Station and the sergeant said, right, this character's been seen on Ham Common. You've got to go up and check it out. One of you has to be armed. And he said, have any of you been trained in firearms? I said, well, I was in the army. Right, he said, you will go with them and take a pistol. Okay. And he went to the safe and got this box out and gave it to me. But it was wrapped in greaseproof paper and still oily. I don't think it had ever been used. His warning to me was, and I remember it to this day, whatever you do, don't upload it. And more importantly, don't shoot anybody. Well, we went, and clearly it wasn't Harry Roberts, it was some vagrant or other.
So you just yomped across Ham Common with a cardboard box?
With a cardboard box. No, actually, I didn't. I sat in the back of the van with it on my knee while they went and spoke to this chap.
Presumably if they'd found Harry Roberts, they'd have had to run back and get you?
Run back and said, do something, yeah.
Brilliant.
That was about the level of it.
Harry Roberts was eventually caught and sentenced to life. The funeral of the 3 police officers brought huge public sympathy. And the Braybrook Street Massacre paved the way for the creation of the Met's armed unit, a team that had never fired a fatal shot until Long himself confronted a gang of armed robbers.
In your own time, starting now.
Like other members of the Met Specialist Armed Unit, Tony Long has spent far more of his time training others than on operational duty.
Get that point of aim in the centre of the line.
The initial firearms training in those days was 5 days. And so that was 4 days on an indoor range. And then if you passed that, you were given 1 day of tactics training, 1 day.
By the early 1980s, the police were facing calls from press and public alike to deal with a new surge in crime: armed robbery.
Armed robbery was a real problem in London at the time. Robbery teams, if they got confronted by unarmed uniformed officers when they were doing a bit of work, to use their parlance, then they would either shoot at the police officers, or they would threaten the police officers with guns, or they perhaps might even take those police officers hostage if that's what it took to escape.
One of these criminals was Bobby Cummins, the nation's youngest ever armed robber when first arrested, aged 16. Now he's an OBE for his services to prison reform.
When I joined in the 70s, there was still a lot of bank robberies going on. It was up to that point, it had been detectives investigating the crime and then going out and arresting you with revolvers. And there came a point where they started to use us.
When you come in, what actually government did, they sent in a government assassination squad. People that would take us out.
Well, it might seem that way. I don't suppose that anyone
It seemed that way to us.
Yes, no, absolutely, I understand that. Did it have an effect on armed robbery?
Well, of course it did. Took out the players and meant the real people was there. People that was involved in the heavy game then had to up their game and think, am I prepared to kill a copper? So it become a more serious bit of game.
You were arrested by us, I think, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
Didn't get shot, did you?
No.
So
only because I didn't have a gun. If I'd have had a tool that day, when them old Bill jumped out on me, I would have shot him. You either dropped the gun and surrendered, or these people were going to kill you, or you whacked them.
When I shot somebody, that wasn't a sentence laid down by a court. That was self-protection, or that was the law that relates to everyone's entitlement to use force to protect themselves.
But that's it, Tony, that's how I see it. People try to kill me 3 times, so, you know, I've had guns fired at me, I've got a bullet hole through my leg.
I get that.
You know,
I get
and
that.
so
I get that, but
anyone
right, you
pulls
know,
a gun on me, Tony, what I looked at, right, in them days, and it sounds terrible and people won't understand this, but when you're in one side or you're the other, and there's a war.
How would you feel if you faced me in a situation where I caught you doing a bit of work?
You've put me in a really awkward situation here because I've met you now as a person. It's a different ball game.
Yeah, but the difference is you'd have been wearing a balaclava and I'd have been wearing a balaclava, so you wouldn't have known.
Then we would have both been shot, wouldn't we?
The rise in armed robbery across London meant Long's unit were coming under growing pressure during the 1980s.
Early today, this abattoir and warehouse complex was surrounded by police hiding in woodland.
In July 1987, acting on a tip-off, Long and his colleagues came face to face with an armed gang as they attempted a robbery.
Operation Kincraig was in action because of a tip-off about a wages snatch. Just after 8, an armed gang moved in. Their target, the Securicorps van containing a huge payroll. 3 robbers threatened the guards with their guns.
We had information from 9 Regional Crime Squad based in East Dulwich that there was going to be an armed robbery on a security van when it delivered to a meat packing factory. The information was that it was going to be a team of 3 or 4 fairly young armed robbers, white, and they were described as hotheads. They had a reputation for opening fire without provocation. They were suspected for a robbery where they'd shot 3 unarmed police officers. And we were also told that they had an arsenal of weapons, and that's the way it was described to us.
Long's armed unit were hidden in the back of a van. None of the abattoir workers, except the manager, knew of the operation.
Okay, so we're being driven in by 2 detectives who are dressed in blood-spattered white coats and the trilbies, trying to look like butchers. There's about 8 of us, including 2 dogs, in the back of this rented Luton van with roller shutters at the back. We've taken a 6mm drill bit and we've drilled observation holes through it. Bright sunny day, and I remember the sun coming through and catching the dust in the air.
Today, the meatpacking factory has been pulled down and turned back to farmland.
Okay, so this is the approach road. So this is the way that we drove in. So we drove in and we parked up over in that corner. And we're probably down in the far corner of this pile of hay that you can see here. It's a hot, sunny day. We've got the 2 dogs in the back that are starting to get the worst of it, so they're starting to pant, and then time ticks by, and it ticks by, and it ticks by. And I eventually see the Securicorps van coming down this approach road. The bad guys are hidden in the woods somewhere in this area here with a view of the loading bay. But we don't know where they are in the woods, and of course we're just looking through a little 6mm hole in the van. And then it's all gone quiet. So your brain starts going, are they still here? So if you imagine I'm looking through a 6mm hole, I've got my eye up against it, and all of a sudden there's a bit of khaki go past me. And I went, well, that's them, that's the robbers. And I went, go, go, go. Roll the shutters going up, really noisy. I remember thinking just how noisy it was. And of course, you know, it was the proverbial tumbleweed. There was nothing there, it was just empty concrete. I was absolutely certain the robbery was happening. So I leapt out of the van, and as I come round the lorry with my pistol in my hand, so I've got 3 guys, all armed. One of the lads, he's got an automatic shotgun, and he's pushing it into the neck of the security guard. I remember starting to shout, armed police, and 2 started turning towards me. You know, you hear a shout of armed police and you drop that gun as if it's white hot, then you've got a chance of surviving, you know, and going to prison. But, you know, I'm not going to turn. I mean, I had 3 people, all, you know, apparently heavily armed, turning at once, or certainly 2 of the pair. One guy was already facing me. All he had to do was take his shotgun from the guard to me in a quarter of a second. If I pause to see whether any one of them's going to surrender, that's going to make me vulnerable and my colleagues vulnerable to the other suspects, so I started shooting.
The robbers turned their guns towards them, apparently as if to shoot. 1 policeman opened fire, 2 of the gang died instantly. The 3rd, badly wounded, tried to escape but was captured.
It was the first fatal shooting that we'd ever had. There hadn't been any shootings in between Northolt and there, so I remember your brain plays tricks with you when you find yourself in a situation like that, and I was literally midway through shooting, and I'm thinking to myself, why is it me again, you know? But realistically, it probably took a matter of seconds to fire those 5 shots, and my colleagues, who didn't even realise a robbery was taking place, were playing catch-up, so it was me again.
It was just a scene of carnage, I suppose is the best way to describe it. I could see that they were either dead or that they were dying. My colleagues were trying to work on them, doing CPR. And I just put my head up against the side of the van and closed my eyes, and I remember stupid things you think about how cold the metal was against my head, because it was like a hot July morning. And my mind is just going 100 miles an hour. I'm thinking, very much like, you know, after I'd shot Errol Walker, I'm thinking, you've done it now, you've shot 3 people. At the end of the day, they're someone's son, aren't they? And I think I'm right in saying that at least one of them was a father as well, you know, and a similar age to me. But, you know, their decision, not mine.
2 of the robbers died at the scene. The 3rd survived and was sentenced to 15 years.
I've sometimes sat and worried, well, how is it that you're not emotional about that? You've taken human life. And clearly some people, you know, aren't cut out for that type of work. But equally, some people see horrendous things, do horrendous things, and cope with it.
When the media learned that the same policeman who had stopped the robbery had also ended the Northolt siege, he was labelled a hero and nicknamed the Equaliser. But Long's growing prominence came at a high cost.
Myself and my family did have death threats. I was sent on a long holiday with my wife and kids to get us out of the country while those threats were managed, and I've lived from that day to today with panic buttons in my house and various other security measures to provide me with protection in case the worst thing happens.
Long continued as an armed officer, but for the next 18 years, he never fired a gun at a suspect.
We're talking about a gap now between 1987 and 2005. Operations would range from state visits, you know, the US president coming over and putting on a, you know, counter ambush team and counter sniper cover, to hostage rescue, kidnap operations, you know, drugs raids on fortified drug dens.
Attack, attack, attack.
In the summer of 2005, after 3 decades of police service, Long was about to retire when a new threat came to London. On the 7th of July, 4 suicide bombers blew themselves up on the London transport network. In response, Long's armed unit were reminded that a range of unusual anti-terrorist tactics already now existed. They were known as Operation Kratos.
Police officers in the United Kingdom are taught to shoot at the largest part of the body, which is the centre mass, the torso. In a Kratos situation, because we're now talking about triggering an explosive device, so we might only just be talking about pressing a button and then killing everyone or seriously injuring everyone in the vicinity, a decision was made that it justified taking a headshot specifically at the brainstem, because by doing so, you hoped to disconnect the brain and the nervous system from the thumb or the triggering device.
2 weeks after the London bombings, police surveillance misidentified Jean Charles de Menezes as one of a new wave of potential attackers. The team trailed him as he headed towards Stockwell Underground Station.
I was involved in the operation in an unarmed role, helping out in the control room and being a liaison officer for other organisations that were working with us.
Once de Menezes had entered the station, the call was made for armed officers to intervene.
Some of the officers sprinted down that escalator to confront this man that they believed was a suicide bomber. As the team went to get on the train, for whatever reason, Jean Charles de Menezes stood up. The special branch surveillance officer who was sitting next to him immediately thought that he was going to detonate the bomb and grabbed hold of him, bear hugged him. The nearest 2 officers then shot him in the head and continued to shoot until they were satisfied that he was no longer a threat.
In front of horrified bystanders, de Menezes was shot 7 times to the head at almost point-blank range. The intelligence, though, was wrong. The Metropolitan Police had just eliminated a Brazilian electrician on his way to fix a broken fire alarm in Kilburn. Long's superiors broke the news to him, and he then had to tell his close colleagues they had killed an innocent man.
He was shot by a couple of very good friends of mine. Obviously, the guys were just grateful to be alive, you know, because they thought they were going to be blown up at any moment. I actually made the phone call to the team leader back at our base. I spoke to him. He was quite buoyant. And then when I told him that it was the wrong person, he just went quite quiet and said thanks for telling him, and he put the phone down. I can't even begin to imagine how it must have been like to have that be told to you. I knew how I felt. Really uneasy, really uneasy.
Rarely had the cost of inaccurate police intelligence been laid so bare. Long's armed unit felt they had acted with professionalism, but the public's reaction to the shooting was one of dismay.
With regards to public perception of armed policing, obviously it was detrimental because an unarmed, innocent member of the public had been shot in cold blood and in very very horrendous circumstances. Everybody in the department, the officers that fired the shots, all of us knew that our part of the operation wasn't wrong, that the fault lay with the build-up to it and that we were given the wrong target, effectively. So, of course, it was a tragedy, but we didn't actually feel that what we had done is wrong. In fact, the guys felt that they'd done what they'd been trained to do.
In 2008, Tony Long retired from the Met. He had been commended 7 times in a 33-year career. But the shooting of de Menezes had damaged the reputation of armed policing. And in 2015, Long found himself the 4th officer in British police history to be tried for murder in the line of duty.
Junction Hale Drive near side. Watch the near side. When we do this.
This is police footage from moments before firearms officer Tony Long shot and killed Azelle Rodney. Police intelligence suggested Rodney and others were in possession of fully automatic submachine guns.
Okay.
And the order was given to arrest them.
Yeah, sweet as.
Is it a leap of faith when I made the decision to shoot Azelle Rodney? I made the decision based on his body language in conjunction with the intelligence that I'd been given, that he posed an immediate threat to my colleagues. And, you know, I believe to this day that I made the right decision.
After Rodney's death, his shooting was investigated. The Crown Prosecution Service initially concluded there was insufficient evidence to charge any individual.
Public inquiry! No cover-up! Public inquiry! No cover-up! Public inquiry!
In 2010, after years of lobbying by Rodney's mother, Suzanne Alexander, a judicial inquiry into the killing began. The inquiry didn't accept Long's version of events. It found that despite his honest belief that Rodney was armed, Long had no lawful justification for the shooting.
This was an unlawful killing. Uniquely, a police shooting has been found to violate the right to life of someone because of the planning of the police operation and the conduct of the officer who fired the shots.
It seemed to me that Azelle was executed.
The inquiry's finding led to the Director of Public Prosecutions concluding that a trial was in the public interest, and there now was a realistic prospect of conviction. In July 2014, Long was charged with the murder of Azelle Rodney. The court was shown evidence that Long may well have decided to open fire on Rodney within just 0.06 of a second of seeing him.
I was absolutely certain he had a gun, but I couldn't see one. I remember having this long conversation with myself about, could I give him any more time? Could I wait to see the gun? No, you can't wait to see the gun. And then firing. You know, none of that thought process could take place in real time. If there's anybody watching this that's been involved in a car accident, you know, they'll probably tell you that everything seemed to slow down and, you know, you're going towards a tree and it seems to take forever. But in point of fact, in reality, it's done.
To some critics, Long seemed a trigger-happy killer who shot before he even had time to think.
Hi.
Hi.
Pleased to meet you.
Lee Jasper, how do you?
Lee Jasper is an activist for the black community.
Well, a few times. Perception of the community is in relation to your engagement, is that you didn't have time to make an assessment. Not only did you shoot Azelle Rodney at once, but you shot him what, 6, 7 times?
Shot him 8 times.
Eight times.
6 rounds, yeah.
So, first of all, was that a trigger-happy response? I have to say, from the black community's perspective, it looked like it was. Secondly, was it disproportionate?
But do you not think a lot of this just comes down to ignorance?
Well, I'm just telling you what the perception is. I mean, you can't blame the public for not knowing the, you know, the engagement protocols of the Metropolitan Police Service.
No, of course you can't.
They're never going to know it. But when they see a video and it looks in the way that yours did, what it looks like to the black community is a summarily execution of an individual without him going to due process.
Since 2001, there have been 16 fatal shootings by police in London. Over half of those killed have come from ethnic minority communities.
The problem for the black community is that we believe is where armed criminality takes place in the white community, people are rarely shot, and when armed criminality takes place in the black community, there is a disproportionate tendency to shoot first.
To me, I think you're overcomplicating the issue. When it comes to the police use of firearms, all we're interested in is, and it's very black and white, has he got a gun or hasn't he? Does he pose, or a knife or another deadly form of weapon? Can I resolve this without having to shoot, or am I going to have to shoot him? Really, the colour of their skin, their ethnicity, or what they're wearing, makes no difference at all.
Have you ever been tested for subconscious bias as in your role as a firearms officer?
Well, not specifically from a racial standpoint, no.
So
but all the training that you do, to me, all right, to every other armed officer I know, the colour of their skin, what they're wearing makes no difference.
But that's not the facts. That's not the facts. The facts is we're all subject to, even black people are subject to subconscious bias against other black people.
I'm not arguing.
So that's the reality.
I know that.
Yeah. So
I know that.
You must be.
Well, I guess I must be. If you're telling me that if you're telling me it's a human thing, what I'm saying, at the end of the day, it's simply this, all right? Has he got a gun or hasn't he got a gun?
Tony Long's trial for murder lasted almost a month. The verdict was due on July the 3rd, 2015. Until that day, no police officer had ever been convicted of killing a suspect illegally.
So on the way in the cab, I was with my partner. Clearly, I'd given thought to the fact that I might be convicted, and my family had done certain practical things to cater for that. And I think it was starting to wear me down at that point. I kept it together, I think, quite well throughout the whole trial. But the last couple of days, I felt very much it was me and my partner against the world, really. I definitely thought that I should be prepared for the worst. Clearly, a police officer's time in prison, if it had come to that, is going to be particularly unpleasant, far more so than a regular prisoner. Bearing in mind, you know, that I'd killed criminals, you know, in the course of my duty.
During the case, I'd not felt emotional about it at all until I came to give evidence, and then I found myself with a bit of a lump in my throat, sort of choking back tears. And I don't like to think of myself as a victim, but I think I just happened to be a victim of circumstance. With the stakes being so high, why would someone be an authorised firearms officer?
Murder. Anthony Long was given the opportunity to recount.
Anthony Long was a highly trained senior Met firearms officer.
The jury, the decision to open fire was the most difficult.
I shouldn't have had to go through a criminal trial. In law, if you have an honestly held belief that your life is in danger or your colleagues' lives are in danger, that entitles you to use reasonable force. If it transpires that you were wrong, but you acted on an honestly held belief, in law, you are not guilty.
After 12 hours of deliberation, and by an 11-1 decision, the jury finally reached its verdict.
His marksman, Anthony Long, was found not guilty of murder.
Anthony Long was the armed officer cleared of the murder of Azelle Rodney.
He joins a long list of police acquitted on the grounds their fatal actions.
When I got found not guilty, I had a sort of 10-minute blub like a schoolgirl. I still don't know why that happened, just a a release perhaps of nervous tension or something I'd been bottling up that I didn't realise I was being bottling up.
Long had been cleared of murder, but the trial left his reputation tarnished.
My attitude to armed policing has been, it's big boys' rules. If you're the police officer that fires that shot, don't be surprised if you find yourself having to justify it, because you will have to justify it. And that's all part of the deal. That's all part of the package of being an authorised firearms officer, which begs the question why anybody does it, in all honesty. People undoubtedly probably do judge me and say, well, for it to do what he's done, he must be some form of psychopath. I didn't get up on the 9th of July 1987 or on Boxing Day 1985 or the 30th of April 2005 thinking I'm going to go and shoot someone. You know, I went there to do a job as best I could, and it just so happened on those 3 occasions I had to do what I was ultimately trained to do. So, how did it feel to shoot someone? It felt like training. It felt like being on a range. If I couldn't cope with the concept of taking someone else's life, then I wouldn't be in that line of work. So when it happens, you know, I didn't want to have to kill anybody, but that was my job, and somebody's got to do it.